There is a researcher who has spent a decade documenting anomalous SAR cases in the Sierra Nevada specifically. He is not a scientist. He is not affiliated with any institution. He is a former backcountry guide who began keeping notes after the third time he heard, from people who had no connection to each other, a description that struck him as too specific to be coincidence. The description was of the silence, not the ordinary silence of the high country. He knew that silence well, had spent hundreds of nights in it. The specific silence that arrives, sometimes, without explanation, in the high granite terrain. Not the absence of wind, the presence of something that the wind had been covering. He began asking questions carefully of SAR coordinators who had worked these mountains for years. He was not asking about the cases, he was asking about the environment in which the cases occurred, the terrain, the conditions, the things that experienced field workers had noticed without knowing what to make of. He found a pattern. It was not universal. Not every case he examined showed it, but across a subset of cases, disappearances, and unusual recoveries in a specific zone of high granite terrain in the southern Sierra. He kept finding the same environmental annotations, brief notations in field notes and SAR logs that referred to unusual conditions in the search area. Unusual quiet, unusual behavior in animals, occasional references to the electromagnetic environment, to equipment malfunctions, to compass anomalies, to the specific electrical feeling in the air that comes before a lightning storm, but was noted in clear conditions with no storm visible. He mapped the cases against the terrain. They clustered, not uniformly across the high Sierra, in a specific corridor of granite terrain between approximately 9,500 and 12,000 feet elevation, in an area defined on one side by a major fault line and on the other by the drainage of a significant river system. The boulder field where the dog stopped in this case falls within that corridor. He has shared this mapping with two SAR coordinators who work the area. Both of them said, independently, that the corridor he had identified matched their own informal mental map of the places that gave them trouble. Neither of them had named it that way before. Neither of them had mapped it. He filed nothing official. He did not publish. He showed his work to a geologist who said the fault line and the drainage patterns he had identified were geologically interesting, but that he had no framework for connecting them to human disappearances. The geologist said, "Interesting," and moved on. The researcher is still mapping. Here is a specific quality to granite country. Anyone who has spent time in the Sierra Nevada understands it without being able to fully explain it. The rock is not simply present, it dominates. Massive domes and faces and ridges that catch the light differently at every hour, that seem to generate their own temperature, that hold the heat of afternoon long into the night and release the cold of altitude in the hour before dawn. The scale is vertical and ancient and indifferent in a way that forest country is not. Forest has texture and depth and a quality of enclosure. Granite country is exposed. You are on it, not in it. The sky is always present. The horizon is always visible. Trail runners come to the Sierra Nevada for this. The specific combination of altitude and exposure and the particular rhythm that granite terrain demands. Shorter steps on technical rock, longer strides on the open slabs, a constant adjustment of gait and attention that experienced runners describe as something close to conversation with the landscape. You learn to read the rock, where it will hold your weight and where it will not, where the friction is good and where a wrong angle will send you. After enough miles on granite, you develop a kinesthetic knowledge of it that operates below conscious thought. He had that knowledge. He had been running trails in the Sierra for 6 years, sometimes for weeks at a time, living out of an ultralight pack and resupplying at trailheads. He was 36 years old. He was, by the accounts of people who had run with him, one of those trail runners who seemed to have arrived in the mountains already knowing them, someone for whom the landscape was not a challenge to be overcome, but an environment to move through with something that looked from the outside like ease. He had done this route before, a traverse through the high granite country of the southern range, covering approximately 40 miles over 3 days at elevations between 8 and 13,000 feet. He had a detailed route plan. He had emergency gear. He had a GPS unit and a paper map as backup. He had satellite messaging capability, the kind that allows you to check in with a text message even without cell service. He checked in on the first evening. A brief message. At planned camp, weather good, feeling strong. That was the last message anyone received. His wife began to worry on the third day. Not immediately, not with the first missed check-in. He was experienced enough that a missed message could mean any number of ordinary things. A technical issue, a shelter location with poor satellite visibility, a decision to push further and arrive at the planned resupply point the following morning. She knew this. She had been through missed check-ins before. She waited. The second missed check-in on the third evening was different. That was the message that was supposed to accompany his arrival at the trailhead parking lot where she was planning to meet him. When it didn't come, she drove to the trailhead. His vehicle was there. He was not. She called the ranger station at 8:40 p.m. The SAR response began the following morning. By midday, teams were on the trail. The Sierra Nevada is different terrain for search operations than the Boundary Waters or the Pacific Northwest coastal ranges. The scale is larger. The elevations are higher, which complicates air operations and requires acclimatized personnel. The granite terrain holds almost no footprints. You cannot track someone across bare rock the way you can in soft forest soil. And the distances involved can be extraordinary. A person who moves fast in this terrain can cover ground that would take a search team days to cover systematically. But the fundamental tools are the same. Dogs, aerial sweep, ground teams working grid patterns outward from the last known position, probability modeling based on the subject's intended route and the terrain between waypoints. They swept the intended route first. Every camp, every waypoint, every water source where he might have stopped. They found nothing at any of the points where the route plan said he should have been. The granite held no footprints, no gear, no sign of disturbance. The dogs were brought in on the third day of the search. The coordinator had learned not to expect much from them on granite. The rock diffuses and disperses scent in ways that make tracking extraordinarily difficult. But she brought them in anyway, starting from the trailhead, where his vehicle was parked. They found his scent. They followed it into the mountains, moving steadily, tracking something the handlers described as unusually clear. They held the trail through the first miles of the route, through the tree line into the open granite above. They stopped at a specific boulder field, not at the edge of it, in the middle of it, a dense cluster of massive granite boulders, some of them the size of small houses, with narrow corridors between them and dark gaps below where the rock sits in its own shadow all day. The same behavior as the dogs in the Pacific Northwest. The same handler's description of it: not losing the scent, refusing. One handler said the lead dog sat down between two boulders and looked at the gap between them, a dark space, perhaps 2 feet wide, that dropped into shadow, and would not approach it. He described the dog's behavior as something he associated with situations of danger, not confusion, recognition of something the dog did not want to get closer to. The coordinator noted it, filed it the same way things like this get filed, briefly, factually, stripped of the interpretive quality the handler had tried to convey. The search ran for 11 days, 11 days of systematic coverage, ground teams on every accessible ridge and drainage, aerial sweeps with both visual and thermal equipment, expanded grid patterns as the days accumulated and the models were revised. Dogs working different sectors, approaching the search zone from different directions. Nothing. Not a boot print in a dusty trail junction. Not a piece of discarded food packaging at a water source. Not a signal from the satellite messenger. Not a thermal signature in 11 days of aerial coverage. It was as if he had stepped off the edge of the known terrain and into something that left no trace in the physical world at all. On the 8th day, the search coordinator called a planning meeting with her team leads. She laid out the options: continued search of the primary zone, expansion to secondary zones, transition to recovery operations. Her teams had been in the field for 8 days at high altitude. Resources were not unlimited. The probability models, after 8 days of negative results in the primary zone, were becoming difficult to interpret. The math was telling her to look in places that had already been looked at. She said in that meeting something she would not have said in the early days of a search, that she was running out of ways to explain the results. Not the missing man, the results, the specific pattern of finding nothing where there should be something. She kept the search active. On the morning of day 12, he walked out of the mountains. He came out on the western slope, from a direction that had no obvious connection to his intended route. The ranger who encountered him was not looking for him in that sector. It was the edge of a different search zone, lower in elevation, on the opposite side of a ridgeline from the boulder field where the dogs had stopped. The ranger was checking water sources as part of a routine patrol that had nothing to do with the active search. He was sitting on a flat shelf of granite above a small creek. He was upright, conscious, and appeared physically uninjured. He was wearing the same clothing and carrying the same gear he had left with. When the ranger reached him and identified himself, he responded coherently and said his name. He did not know what day it was. He thought when the ranger asked that he had been out for 2 or 3 days. He said, "It felt like 2 or 3 days." When the ranger told him it had been 11, he went quiet. He looked at the mountains around him, the peaks, the ridges, the afternoon light on the western faces, in a way the ranger later described as someone trying to read a language they suddenly couldn't quite recognize, as if the landscape that should have been familiar had acquired a quality of strangeness he was attempting to process. His wife arrived at the ranger station by early evening. She would describe the reunion in very compressed terms in the years afterward, not evasively, but with the specific compression of moments that contain too much to fully unpack in narration. She said he was fine. She said he was with her. She said, "I looked at him, and I thought, that's him, and also not quite. That quality of almost him." She returned to it. She could not explain it, and she did not try to explain it to the researcher who eventually spoke with her. She just noted it as a fact she was holding. The medical evaluation documented mild dehydration and some muscle fatigue, but no injuries and no signs of exposure or hypothermia. For a person who had spent 11 days at altitude in the Sierra Nevada, this was physiologically unexpected. Even experienced ultralight runners operating in favorable conditions would show more physical cost from 11 days in the high country than the evaluation documented. His caloric state was assessed as the equivalent of 1 to 2 days without food, not 11. His boots, good trail runners, the kind that show wear quickly on granite, showed approximately 40 miles of use. He had planned to cover 40 miles in 3 days. The boots showed what 3 days of running on granite should look like, not 11. This finding appeared in the medical evaluation as a brief notation and was not followed up on in the official report. The search coordinator, when she saw it later, said she read it 3 times. The search coordinator debriefed him the day after his recovery. She was experienced at this. The recovery interview is a standard procedure conducted once the subject is medically stable and oriented, designed to gather information that might improve SAR outcomes in future cases. What did you do when you realized you were in trouble? Where did you try to go? What did you eat and drink? Where did you sleep? He answered these questions to the extent he could. He had eaten from his pack. He had filtered water from a creek. He could not say which creek or where it was. He had slept in his bivvy. He could not identify any of the locations where he had slept. He could describe the general quality of the terrain. Granite, open, at altitude, but not the specific features that would allow it to be mapped. He had 11 days of experiences that could not be located. She asked him if he could remember where he had been when he had first realized something was wrong. He thought about it for a long time. He said he did not remember a moment of realizing something was wrong. He said it was more like, and here he paused and looked for words, more like being somewhere that was ordinary in a way he didn't have context for. She asked him what he meant by ordinary. He said, familiar, like a place I'd been before, but I couldn't say when. She asked if he could describe the place. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, there were rocks, big rocks, like the boulder fields up here, and it was quiet, very quiet, like the mountains get sometimes when the wind stops and the birds stop and everything just holds. She recognized the description. She had been in those moments in the Sierra herself, the silence that falls in high country when the afternoon thermals die and the birds settle, a quality of complete stillness that felt at those moments as if the mountains were attending to something. He said, it felt like that, but all the time. And then he looked at the table, and she didn't ask more. His wife told the researcher about the conversation approximately 3 years after the search. She told it in careful installments, the way you tell something you have been carrying for a long time and have not been sure whether to put down. She began with the practical facts, the recovery, the medical evaluation, the return to normal life that followed. She described how he had gone back to running, though not in the Sierra, not at those elevations, not in the granite country that had held him for 11 days. She described how he had been, in most ways, himself. She said, "There was one conversation, about 6 weeks after he came home. We were having dinner. It was an ordinary evening. She said he had been quiet through most of the meal. Not unhappy, she said. Thinking. And then he had said, with the same matter-of-fact tone he might have used to say that he needed to pick up coffee in the morning. There was a doorway in the rock. She said she had put down her fork. He said, in the boulder field, there was a way through. I don't know how to describe it, except that it wasn't a gap between the boulders. It was more like, and then he stopped. She said he tried a few more times to find the words. He said it was like the rock had a different quality in that place, like it was both solid and not solid at the same time, like it was an edge rather than a surface. She said she asked him what was on the other side. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I don't think on the other side is quite right. It was more like another version of here. The same mountains, the same rock, but different. Empty in a way that this isn't empty. Very still. She said she had not known what to say. She had asked, were you afraid? He said no. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I wasn't afraid at all. It felt like somewhere I was supposed to be. Like somewhere I'd been before that I'd forgotten about. Then he finished his dinner. He went to wash the dishes. He never raised the subject again. She asked him about it once, a few months later. He said he didn't want to talk about it. Not in a way that suggested distress. In a way that suggested he was protecting something, either protecting the experience from the imprecision of words or protecting himself from the place those words led. She said, I believe him. I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying I understand what happened or what he found. I'm saying I believe that something happened and that what he described is the closest he could get to it. She said, the doorway, the other version of here, the thing about being somewhere you'd been before. She said, that's the thing I can't put down. The Sierra Nevada has been inhabited for thousands of years by people whose relationship to this specific landscape is encoded in ways that outside researchers are only beginning to understand. The Nuyumu, the people known to outsiders as the Paiute, have lived in and around the Sierra Nevada since long before the first European contact. Their knowledge of this terrain is accumulated over generations of specific, direct experience. The kind of knowledge that knows not just where the water is, but what the water does, not just where the passes are, but what the passes mean, not just the geography of the place, but its character. Some of that knowledge has been recorded. Some of it has been shared with researchers who approached with the right kind of patience. Some of it is held privately as practical guidance for people who live in specific terrain and need specific guidance for navigating it safely. What has been shared in various forms includes references to places in the high granite country where the normal rules of navigation do not entirely apply, places where a person can become disoriented in ways that do not correspond to conventional navigational error, places where the experience of time can shift in ways that are difficult to describe but that have been documented across many generations of direct experience. These references are not presented in the traditional accounts as supernatural phenomena. They are presented as features of specific terrain, practical information for people who need to move through the mountains safely. The specific boulder field where the dogs stopped. It is not a named feature. It is not marked on any map, but it falls within a zone of high granite terrain that several different research contexts have identified through entirely different methodologies as significant. The dogs stopped at its edge. He came through it and did not know where he had been. And the rock, apparently, has a doorway that is not a gap. His wife continued running after the event, after the recovery, after the conversation over dinner that she never forgot. She ran in the foothills and in the coastal ranges, not in the high Sierra. She ran the way people run when running is what holds them together, not for performance, not for adventure, but for the specific quality of moving through landscape that keeps you in your body and in the present tense. She said, "I've thought about it a lot, about what it would feel like to step through something like that. To find yourself in a place that looks like here, but isn't quite. To be there for 11 days, whatever 11 days means, in a place like that, and come back." She said, "I think he's the same person. I believe that. But I also think something changed. Not in a bad way. In the way that experiences change you. In the way that going somewhere changes you." She said, "He doesn't look at the mountains the same way. Not with fear." She was careful about this. Not with the aversion of someone who has been hurt in a place, with something closer to the attention you give, to somewhere that has given you something and that you're not sure you've fully understood yet. She said, "Sometimes I'll see him looking up toward the high country in a way that I recognize but don't have a word for. Like he's checking in with something. Like there's something still happening between him and that terrain that neither of us has figured out how to talk about." She said, "I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's just true." The case that follows in this series takes us east, out of the granite country of the Sierra, into the high plains and mountain wilderness of Wyoming. Two hunters, two experienced, careful men who knew exactly how to move in this specific terrain, who went in together and came out separately. One of them 3 weeks later, walking out of country he could not remember traveling through. The other still missing, 40 miles from his last known position. In the specific kind of terrain that this series keeps returning to, the intersection of high elevation, geological complexity, and the silence that arrives before things happen that do not have ordinary explanations. The investigation continues into the silence before and what comes after it.